Welcome to Enhancing the Human Experience. I'm Mark Phillips, and in this episode, it's all about helping you distill your genius and improve your performance. My guest today is David Ogle. David is the founder of Dose Coaching out of Vancouver, British Columbia. And in this episode, we talk about not only helping you improve your performance, but also helping you create and maintain that beginner's mindset, that sense of childlike wonder, which is, as we all know, so vitally important in business and in life, right? Freeing ourselves from the known or from this perfectionistic mindset and idea that is really somewhat pervasive in our society. And we also talk about how you can get your morning cup of inspiration. Dose Coaching every Friday morning. David sends out a short email, and the purpose of that email is to stimulate your mind, to help you to have a different perspective, sharing insights and just information that is valuable to you when you start your day. Comes out every Friday morning. We talk about that near the end of the episode, and also how you can sign up to receive that inspirational email. So I really enjoyed this interview. I think you're going to get a lot out of it. I know that I did. Without further ado, let's jump into the interview. All right, David, thank you for joining me today on the podcast. I'm super excited to dive into your work and Dose Coaching. So thanks for hanging out with me today.
Thanks for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
Thank you. So let's talk about how, you run Dose Coaching, you're a performance coach. How did you get to this point? Give us a little bit of a background on your journey thus far.
It's something when I really think about it, throughout my life, I whether I had the language for it or not, I had a minor, maybe a major fascination around leadership. Every sports team that I was on, I was a captain, and it wasn't that I was obsessed with being a leader, but I actually think it was more kind of the inverse, that there was something about leadership and the impact of it that I just deeply valued and cared about. And because of that, found myself in leadership positions. And I didn't even realize this until probably, my mid-20s, when I had this moment of, right, the thing that I get frustrated with the quickest, whether it was in career or sports teams or clubs, was usually something around the effectiveness or ineffectiveness of leadership. And so when I look at where I am now with my business and doing leadership work and coaching work with business leaders, and it just kind of makes sense that, like, I see the thread of, there was this experience of caring about leadership, constantly pursuing, being curious about it, finding the language of leadership theory, and then finding myself in a place within an organization where I actually wanted to do marketing work, and then made the shift, realized it wasn't marketing work that I cared about. It was the impact that people could have on other people. Oh, it was leadership. And quickly diverted directions, which is good because I would be an absolutely awful marketer.
So you kind of realized that and kind of pivoted a little bit, huh?
Yeah. It was, at the time it felt like kind of a small realization, but it was a huge turning point. And then I started making decisions around what are the roles or what are the things that I can do that will allow me to be in the leadership conversation more and more, and at higher levels and at different levels. And I just have an insatiable appetite. So yeah, I guess to your question, like, that journey led me to a place where I found coaching is the means that I truly believe in. I think it's so effective and helpful when working with leaders, and leadership it's the purpose for me.
Yeah, well, and that's what I find that, I'm assuming that's a very gratifying thing to help leaders, like you say, evolve and become better, other leaders and other people in professional or sports. Do you get a lot of value? You probably get a lot of sense of value out of that.
I get a ton of value out of it. And it's funny you say it, because it was something that was, I had to almost reconcile of most people that I've met that are also keen on the leadership conversation love being a leader.
Mm.
And what I found for myself was that's secondary for me. Like I don't mind being a leader. I've been a leader plenty of times and I'm not awful at it. But what I love is supporting leaders being better leaders. And that was unique for me to realize that like I'm happy being like that guide on the side rather than the person on the stage, front and center.
Yeah, well, I think you bring up an interesting point. There does seem to be that conflict just in what I see in the field of coaching, where the person either wants to be maybe up on the stage, like you said, being the leader, and then their client takes the second seat, unfortunately. But I like that fact when you switch it around and support, be underneath and support them. That's a little bit different dynamic than you see kind of prevalent in the industry, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a great point of in the coaching industry and even in the broader industry of leaders, there's a lot of value in recognizing that my greatest work is not represented by me. So
Mm-hmm.
as a coach, it's not about me. That's why I didn't name my business after myself. That's what I love about dose performance coaching is it's that dose of insight and curiosity and perspective that allows the leader to go and show their full performance. And at no point does that have anything to do with me showing up in that, other than like being there for that person.
I like that. Yeah. So that's kind of the etymology of your dose coaching business. Then is you're giving them that dose of the assistance and support. It sounds like.
Yeah. Or as a friend did explain to me, they're like, well, you could also say it stands for David Ogle, super excellent coaching, which I think is super funny and was at
Even though
no
you didn't
point,
plan it that way, right? It's like that. That's
no,
kind of
not
sounds like you
intended
got
at
a good
all.
friend.
But yeah, I think of what great coaching is it really is that moment or that perspective that kind of feels like a dose experience that is consistent over time.
Yeah, I like that. One of the things and we talked about this prior in our conversation, and it's right on your website, and I want to dive into it and have you unpack it a little bit for us about this notion of distilling your genius. Talk about that concept within your business, if you would.
Oh my gosh, how much time do we have? Sit down, people. Here we go. No,
Yeah, here we go. Here we roll. Because I think it's fantastic, and let me give you the reason I asked that, David, is, when we talked prior, we were talking about performance, and you said something that I thought was really important. And you said, reflecting on your own journey and also that of your clients, you're like, am I doing the right thing? Because in the world we live in, everyone's telling us to do everything. There's, social media and all these platforms. It's like, be everywhere, do everything. And that becomes a detriment in the long term. And I think you touched on something really important that I think would be valuable for listeners is, distilling your genius, doing the right thing for you, in
right,
relationship to performance as well.
right. Yeah. So when I go back to, again, I think the etymology of distill your genius, it connects really nicely to what we were talking about earlier of as a great or a responsible coach, I recognize that it's not my genius that is, on display in a coaching conversation. Really, my role is to support someone in the process of distilling their genius. And what I mean by that is, the anecdotally, the experience I've had my entire career is I work with brilliant people. And this isn't saying like I only work with brilliant people. It's more every time I really slow down and listen to almost anyone I talk to, that sounds judgmental otherwise. Um,
Yeah.
anyone I talk to, like everyone has a level of untapped genius. It's just a matter of are they doing the things to cultivate and curate that genius and simplify it down in a way that's actionable or they can do something with it. And that's really where distill your genius comes from is what I see coaching offering for people is that space to slow down and capture those genius ideas that otherwise might slip away or go unnoticed. My favorite question to ask people is, when you think about where do you have your best ideas during the day, the three most common responses, and everyone listening to this podcast, you probably thought of one of these three. It's when your head hits the pillow right before you go to bed. It's when you're showering, or when you're working out or going for a walk or going for a run or something like that. It's because we live in this world that is so fast paced and full, and it's wonderful, but we don't have the time to slow down and really capture our insights or even generate insights. So it's a byproduct of how the brain has to function. Like, I have to step out of focusing in order to generate insight. But if I'm focusing 8, 12 hours a day, my brain's never going to generate insight until it gets a chance to not focus, which is going for a run, right when I go to bed, or when I'm in the shower. And the fundamental problem with that is those aren't very good times to have your most genius insights.
Yeah, not really, right?
Right? And so that's really where Distill Your Genius comes from. Is it's this process that intentionally creates that insight experience and allows someone to have that at a time that's actually appropriate and helpful.
Yeah. Well, and you hit the nail on the head. We're so busy trying to, hammer things out. We don't give ourselves that space to let those ideas come in, do we?
Totally. It's, I think one of my favorite things to tell clients, probably to a point that it drives them it makes them very annoyed. That's the problem. I'm glad that's recorded for eternity. But the thing that I find myself saying a lot is slow down. The world is fast paced. There's all sorts of things going on. And the more that we can slow down, it's incredible to see what we notice. The metaphor I love is try and see how many things you can notice driving in a car at 80 miles an hour. Then go ride a bike as fast as you can. See how many more things you notice even then. And then go take a walk and see all the little things you notice that you never would have seen on either of those. It's not to say we have to walk everywhere, but if we're never walking, we're going to miss something.
And I've heard, people talk about that in relationship to, when they're driving the car, it's a totally different experience than, like you say, if they're walking down the street or riding a bike and they just notice these different things. That, I think you've touched on something really important, is this notion of slowing down. Years ago when I used to practice the Japanese martial art of Aikido, that was one of the things that the sensei would always say, because there's this tendency to just rush through it and speed through it, and you lose. And I'm sure you've had this experience in your sports career and in your life. When you rush it and forget about the movement and the fundamentals and the actual practice of it, you lose everything and you just go right to the end. And I think people lose that foundational portion. Do you find it's challenging to get people to actually really internalize that idea of slowing down, or what's the difficulty level that people are resistant to that?
I love everything you just said. It's so a couple of things that came up for me. I've started doing Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu about 8 months ago. I'm so bad at it. Well,
that's what I hear. Everyone is bad at it at the beginning. I hear I understand it's very humbling. Is that what you would say?
Yes, and it was, as you were sharing that, I'm like, right, that's been even my personal journey with Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. I've played sports my whole life. I'm athletic. I'm relatively strong, and my first class, and even still, the number one thing that people remind me or tell me to do is don't forget to breathe.
I've heard that.
Slow down, breathe. Yeah. And it was the first time someone told me that, I was like, oh my gosh, I tell clients this. Why are you telling me to slow down? Oh, right. I'm a beginner again. So it's
awesome.
Experience.
I love that. Yeah, that's definitely on my list as well, to study that. I've heard so many people talk about the positive benefits of, multi-spectrum positive benefits from jujitsu. That's awesome. So you're kind of the beginner in the class here, starting
Mhm.
this new endeavor. That's awesome.
But the reason I mention it and why it connects to what you were saying is like where people struggle with internalizing it is there's a balance, and it's oftentimes why I tell someone go try something new physically it when you're feeling stuck or like you're struggling internalizing that notion of slowing down, because there's nothing like being humbled physically to wake you up to an insight that's actually relevant to the rest of your life. It's like in
Mm.
being a beginner in jujitsu, it's also forced me to like slow down and look at the rest of my life and really think, where else do I actually need to adopt more of a beginner mindset that I'm not
Hmm.
currently?
Yeah.
I think a
Yeah.
garbage truck just ran over a garbage can.
That's okay. It's so true. I think what sometimes, when we get on autopilot, back to what you were mentioning earlier, when you start not noticing things that are happening in any area of your life and become on autopilot in what business or sports or jujitsu or whatever you're practicing, that's when I think there's a tendency for, I don't want to say danger, that might be too strong a word, but, we there's no growth and there's no more like wonder and amazement, and we start to kind of lose that edge, don't we?
You nailed it with the word wonder. One of my favorite philosophers is Jacques Derrida, which I
Mm-hmm.
probably butchered his name. Um, my partner is French Canadian and
Mm-hmm.
can't
She,
stand my French
I
pronunciation.
so they'd be down on you for butchering that
Yeah.
name.
So sorry to anyone who speaks better French than me. Anyways, one of his things that he would talk about is this notion of childlike wonder and how do we view the world through childlike wonder. And his was more on the metaphysical sense of like that could be the meaning of life, and I won't bore you with all that, but the concept of childlike wonder has always fascinated me and felt like such an important premise in leadership. Of the moment I see myself as the quintessential subject matter expert, like the person who has all the decision making rights, and I'm not viewing things with childlike wonder, I've lost.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's such a good point. It really, really is. So keeping that wonder, it's so important, because otherwise life just gets to be in the doldrums, doesn't it?
Well, yeah, I think that's the risk. Is it's really, it's funny that this is, I think my background is coming out of the undergrad in philosophy and the
Mm-hmm.
master's in applied neuroscience, like this weird amalgamation of
It is.
philosophical and, oh right, and this is just how our brain works. Of the problem is it's deeply tempting for me to always have the answers or to be that subject matter expert, because it's highly rewarding initially. Like, I experience reward when I tell someone the answer is whatever and it's true, and then people are like, "Oh, you're so smart." And that
Mm-hmm.
feels good, and I get praised and I become successful and I get promotions. The problem is it creates almost an insurmountable pressure on me to continue to always have the answer.
Mm.
And over time, the stress of that begins to outweigh the benefits of having the answer.
Yeah.
And then I end up in a position of leadership where I'm actually not being paid to have the answer. But
Mm-hmm.
I feel the reason I've gotten to that leadership position is because I've always had the answer. So it's this catch 22 of I can't necessarily become a leader without having some answers. And I
Mm-hmm.
actually think that's true. But
Right.
once I become a leader, my job is to cultivate the capacity for everyone around me to have the answers.
Yeah.
And that's a
Well,
different mindset.
I think you touched on something really important, because we are kind of a culture and a society of, the answers, right? We're in school, we're groomed for that. And then we get into business and it's like, what's the answer? What's the answer? And it does put a lot of pressure on us. When you were talking about that, something came to my mind. I recently heard that the Dalai Lama is famous for saying quite a lot, I don't know. Right. And this is a guy who's, tuned in and tapped into, deep spirituality. And he says a lot of, I don't know. And I think that lets us off the hook, at least makes me feel better when I don't know, you know?
Yeah, I mean, if the Dalai Lama doesn't know, a guy who's
Yeah,
meditating up teen hours a day, who is the embodiment of compassion in the world, if he's okay with walking around saying, I don't know, that gives us a big get out of jail free card that I
it
think
does.
cash in daily.
It really does, yeah, and we can because it goes back to that wonder again. Because sometimes I think knowing can put us in a box, and especially when you think you know and you don't know, and then that's very dangerous because you try to do something, you transfer the knowledge into action, and you don't get the result. But when you take that wonder and curiosity and become like that child, like you mentioned, that's when things start to really unfold. Because who really does know, right? I mean, ultimately, the game board's always changing.
Spot on. It's, what you just said there. Like, yes, it's so important of, again, our brain is obsessed with predicting what's next. Like it is right now, both of our brains are focusing on the predictable future of the next few moments. And it knows, air quotes, knows what is going to happen next, which is why when something totally from left field or unexpected occurs, it throws us off. And to tie in performance, I think this is one of the fundamental principles of performance, whether it's on a team in sports or a team in an organization or just on a personal level, is being able to navigate confidence, but not getting it to a place of, I know exactly what is going to happen and needs to
Mm,
happen. And I think like sports ends up being a great metaphor for that, of the team that wins the championship is not the one that has the best game plan. It's the one that has the most adaptable game plan to meet
mm,
the needs as the game evolves, because the second half is never the same as the first half.
mhm. Yeah, that's a really good point. Let it evolve in a natural way, because then things happen that you can never predict, right? You'll never know. And you touched on something really interesting. One of the things that because you do, you're recording the podcast. You want it to be an epic experience for you, my interviewee, and the listeners. And I want it to be this great thing. And one of the things that I started doing many episodes ago is just setting this conscious intention that it will be that and that it is going to be that, and then letting it unfold in the natural way. And it's mind blowing when it arrives at that end. It's really fascinating.
Yeah, there's a juxtaposition of like the two P words. There's performance and then there's perfection. And when I start to ambiguate the two, I go to a really dark place, because
Oh, really?
if I'm pursuing performance, that's great. But as soon as I allow performance to start to become like the end state, become perfection. So a podcast, another P word, right? But uh,
Yeah.
if I'm looking at this podcast of, it's got to be perfect, I want everyone who's listening to this to think um, amazing things, like I've lost.
Yeah.
Rather than, to your point, like how do we enjoy the process of performing, of talking about things we care about and we're passionate about, and allow that to unfold in a way that it will add value to someone. And
Hmm.
if there's someone who right now they just turned it off because they're not interested, that's
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah.
The
Yeah.
person who just turned the volume up a little bit, like high five to you. Like, I love that you're listening to this.
Exactly. So performance and perfection. Do you feel that it sounds like you feel it's important to like detach the two and focus on the performance, improving your performance, or helping your clients improve their performance, and kind of taking the focus off perfection?
Absolutely. I think perfection can be tied into a lot of different concepts, but that relationship of, as again, I look at myself in jujitsu. Like initially, zero expectations for myself. I knew I was bad. I didn't even know what
Yeah.
it was when I walked in. So
Yeah.
the first 5 minutes were quite a shock. But as I take on a task and develop mastery, and I think this really applies well to people's careers, as I get better at things, I start to expect more of myself. I start to understand what high performance looks like. That excites me, that engages me. until I hit a critical point where I expect myself to know everything or be able to handle anything, and then it's a slippery slope towards perfection.
Mm-hmm.
And I think like that's that critical juncture that as people, that's where we need leaders to guide us and cultivate our thinking around, oh, yeah, 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 it's good. Like you can keep performing and you still have room to grow. Like perfection is so far off and
Mm-hmm.
also unattainable.
Yeah. Well, there might be a distinction between perfection and effectiveness, because
Mm,
I've always viewed, especially recently, perfection as an illusion, some place that is just you will never arrive at it. What even is perfection, right? I mean, with the game board always changing, with human beings always in this dynamic state of growth and awareness and expansion, and then the world game board always changing. I don't even know if perfection is perfection, right? I
right.
mean,
Yeah, it's a unicorn. It's
it
absolutely a
is a unicorn. And I think, for me, one of the best realizations is to actually realize that, because I'm a recovering perfectionist myself. And once you realize it is an illusion, you can kind of push it aside and get to the real work of improving your performance and being better and showing up better. And that's where that mastery starts to come into play.
Yeah, it's a great point. I think the perfection and performance spectrums actually eat away at each other. Of if I'm
Mm.
leaning too far towards one, it actually detracts from my ability to do the other. So high performance inherently means I have a general understanding of perfection is not my goal.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and it seems like so much in life, once we can get past that, and it seems like all of the successful people have realized this, that the way they got where they're at is they just sucked. And like you said, you walk in, you're going to suck, the experience is going to be humbling. You go on the mat and do your thing, and it's like they kind of suck their way to success, right? They fail and fail, and this, it just seems like that's the process, and no one wants to do that, because no one wants to feel like, oh, I just produced this thing that sucked, or I just wrote this paper that sucked. But that's the only way to get there, in my experience, is like to just suck every day until you finally don't suck a little bit less, right?
Yeah, well, it's funny. It goes back to childlike wonder and being a beginner for me of I have to be a beginner and I actually have to always have that beginner mindset, that childlike wonder throughout everything I'm doing because the moment that I lose it, I become disillusioned with my grandeur. And I think that starts again to lean towards perfection versus there's something really valuable about the mindset of someone who sucks or is a beginner or just doesn't know what they're doing yet. And it's like, how do you keep that even as you develop your capacity to perform at a higher level? And
Yeah,
that,
that's a really good point.
that's such a beautiful tension. And I
Hmm.
think, some of the leaders that I work with that by no means have mastered it, but display it in bits and bytes in ways that really impact their organizations. And it's incredible to watch that tension of beginner mindset, constant curiosity, but also just incredible levels of mastery and performance in their field.
I can imagine. I can imagine that's just thrilling to see that those like two ideas come together in a leader. You touched on this briefly earlier in the podcast about some of the questions that you ask, like when you ask them to start distilling their genius, and talked about when genius comes in. Do you have, say, like a set approach that helps you kind of dive into the leader that you're working with, the client that you're working with, to help them start to make a space for their genius and distill it? Or do you find it's kind of dynamic for every client? Do you have a set process you like to work through?
Both.
Okay.
It's I think it stems from our conversation of the game board's always changing. And
Hmm.
that's one of the things I love about coaching is it's such a dynamic conversation that evolves over time. And because a client's game board for themselves is changing, whether it's in work or their life, the process of coaching and working with them also has to be dynamic and agile.
Mm, yeah.
That said, I think like if I were to say like the methodology that I find is really helpful of there's four buckets that I think are really important for people to walk through. And
Okay.
it's not linear, but it is somewhat sequential in that they do evolve off of each other, but you can go back to them. So the first one is awareness, and I love the concept of awareness simply because as soon as I set my intention or my mind to I need to increase my awareness around something, I will. I may not like what I become aware of, but I will increase my awareness. And like that's one of the fundamental brilliant things about our brain is it's capable of just being increasingly aware of things as we bring our energy and our focus towards it. So it's
Hmm.
developing awareness, and then what that leads to is thoughtfulness. So the second bucket is thoughtfulness. It's spending a little bit more time. It's that slowing down concept. It's taking the time to start to see all the things that are in my field of awareness. And this is, I would say the beginning of the distillation process of consolidating it and condensing it into, oh, I see these 20 things and here's the thread. So it's being thoughtful. And what you're even starting to see is that notion of the thread is the third bucket, which is insight. I think insight is one of the most undervalued skills of our mind, in that we love it. We love experiencing it because it's physically rewarding. We actually experience reward when we
Hmm.
have insight. Yet rarely do we harness the insights that we have and take action on them. So from that thoughtfulness, when that insight emerges, uh, that's really capturing it, getting clear on what actually is the insight, what does that mean, and then the fourth bucket is action. Like, what am I going to do? And that's going to distill your genius. It's about helping people develop awareness, bring more thoughtfulness to whatever it is they're examining, generating insight, and from that taking simple, doable actions that actually have a habitual, long-lasting impact.
Wow. Yeah, that process is really awesome. Do you find that different clients are, I guess, more prone to say be aware, but maybe have a lesser proclivity to some of the others, and maybe some people are super action oriented and others are low awareness? What's your experience with working with different clients and how this kind of plays out?
I think the easy answer is like, yes. People are so diverse, and it's one of
Hmm.
the fun parts of my job is I work across all sorts of industries, from finance to hotels to retail. It's really interesting seeing the diversity of thought and the impact of one's environment. I think of uh, someone who's in finance, whether they like it or not, has some environmental things that have influenced the way they look at and see the world. Um,
Hmm.
which I think that's really interesting. So that brings even more diversity just across people, and yet there again, from my perspective, there's some really interesting threads that are common for a lot of people, and it's the unique articulation for each person may be different, but there's areas that we all have opportunity to consider a little bit more or think about a little bit more deeply. I think like a classic one, whether you're the CEO of an organization or you're a coordinator who just started yesterday, like comparison comes up in some capacity. And so
Hmm.
addressing that and having a look at, well, what's that mean for you?
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think that model is super awesome because it seems like it's like a full spectrum of, like you said, starting with the awareness and then to translating that all the way into action, and then I'm sure that's an effective model to help people kind of navigate their leadership in their business or life.
Yeah, what I like about it too is if I'm super career oriented, that means I've put more energy towards my career, and that's a great thing, but I can't focus on everything all the time. So what that model also helps with is it forces me to stop again and slow down and look at what's the areas that maybe I haven't looked at, and sometimes the biggest thing I can do to support my career is take care of something personally. Like if I'm not working out, I'm not taking care of my body. That's going to have diminished returns long term on my mental capacity and my mental health. So if I want to have, a long term career that's sustainable, then the awareness may actually need to come in terms of physical health. And that's important because, one of my favorite images that was shown to me by a professor some years ago was he put up an image of the entire neural network, so for the brain and all the nervous system, and
Mm-hmm.
it looks like a human body. He's like, so which is the body and which is the mind? And
Mm.
looking at it, what you instantly realize is we talk about mind body connection, and his premise was there's no difference. Like you have one thing. The body is a byproduct of the mind, and the mind is a byproduct of the body. Like they're one thing. So trying to separate them is actually going the wrong direction from the start.
Yeah, well, and that it kind of fritzes with the human brain because we want to compartmentalize, don't we? We want to like this is the mind, this is the body, but that's an awesome visual to have there because you're right. Looking at that, you don't see any distinction.
Of course, and where is the mind getting all its stimulus? From the nerves in the body.
Mhm. It's all like this integrated system, right? You can't like dissect it. It's all one package. That's awesome.
Yeah, yeah. I find that a helpful way to think about it.
Yeah, that's super awesome. So let's talk about how people can learn more about your work, even though I will also share your website and your platforms in the show notes beneath this episode at gmarkphillips.com. Uh, Tell people how they can get in touch with you.
The easiest way to get in touch with me is my website, so dosecoaching.com, or emailing me, david@dosecoaching.com. That's really everything I've built has been designed to push people towards that. I'm always happy to chat with people. I'm quite good at getting back to emails within a day,
Mm-hmm.
2 days. I'm super busy, so I'm hesitant to say that. Then 1,000 people email me.
Yeah, right.
But, it's yeah. I think one of the things I'm passionate in the world of coaching is making coaching more accessible to more people. And with that, it comes a very strong responsibility or perspective of when people do reach out, like how do I make myself accessible just to answer questions? And I think that's why email, it really is, it's the easiest way to get a hold of me, and it's something I'm deeply committed to responding
Mhm.
around.
Okay. And to that point, can you walk us through what the initial process is for, say that initial contact with a client and maybe a little bit of an intake until and working with them? Can you walk us through what they can expect when they reach out to you and want to
Yeah.
go further and learn about your process?
Yes, I'm laughing because I'm actually going through or I have been going through that process with some lawyers, and I
Uh-huh.
I am so annoyed. So any lawyers listening to the podcast, no offense, but your industry needs to change. Like
There's-
why do I have to pay? Why do I have to pay you to determine whether I even want to work with you? Like do I buy a car before I
Yeah,
can drive?
the lawyer industry is different than they somehow get a pass, don't they? They don't have to be very very helpful. You just got to pay every time, right?
I feel like I'm walking into a restaurant and paying money to see the menu, which
Yeah.
maybe I'm not going to fancy enough restaurants.
I
Okay.
totally agree. When I've had to work with lawyers in the past, you just feel like you're talking about, we were talking about earlier in the podcast where you're supporting your clients. It's like totally switched around when you're working with a lawyer. You feel like you're just honored to be in their presence, right?
Yes. So the reason, of course, that came to mind is then I look at my model and like this, I of course like more because it's mine. But a client reaches out or a potential client reaches out. What I will offer to anyone is an hour of my time to talk through an intake process, and what the intake entails. Um, the relationship with the coach, it really matters, and I don't ever want to diminish that. So in that hour, we spend a good chunk of time learning about the potential client, as well as sharing about myself. I want someone to know more about me, my approach, what it's like to work with me. And then the third piece really is looking at what are the outcomes. And I think it's critical in that initial conversation to get clear. What is it that someone is seeking coaching out for? What's the impact? What would success look like? Because it allows both of us to make an informed decision of, right, this is a good relationship. We should move forward. Or, you know what? Coaching might be what you're looking for, and my approach isn't. Here are some other coaches. Like I love referring people to other great coaches, because in the end, I want someone to find the person that's going to support them best rather than me.
Right. Rather than just plug and play, right? If it's not the right fit.
Yeah, because and plug and play is a great point. Like I do coaching because I don't believe in out of the box solutions. There aren't box shaped people, and I also don't think there are box shaped solutions for non box shaped people. So it's so important to have that initial conversation to really clarify what is it and how is it that we can work together, and what's the best way forward to support someone.
Right, right. It sounds like that's a very complete process, where you're finding out all of their end goals and the outcomes they want in that initial intake. And it seems like it gives you a full picture, like you said, from both sides, for them working with you and you working with them.
Yeah, because what I also acknowledge is coaching is not inexpensive. I want someone to make an informed decision. I wouldn't want them to go through 2 sessions with me and be like, whoa, I'm paying how much for this? This
Mm-hmm.
is what I want. Like,
Yeah.
let's get that out of the way from the start. Like we need, both people need to choose each other to be in the relationship.
That's a good point. That's a good point. Well, thanks for sharing that intake. And I'll also, before we wrap up, I want to remind people you also do Morning Cup. Tell us about Morning Cup.
Right. That's actually a great way for people to connect with me. Thank
Yeah.
you for being my champion.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's what I'm here for.
So Morning Cup is the like long story, as short as I can tell it, is it was a what, how did it was this side project that it started before Dose even.
Oh,
It was
really?
started like back in my like career corporate days, as a it started as this acknowledgement that we needed as an organization to be having conversations about who we were, what our culture was, and the impact of leadership. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
it was inspired a lot by Seth Godin. I love that man's blog. I think
I agree.
his ability to turn out content daily that is consistently quite good and very
Mm-hmm.
often great
Mm-hmm.
blows my mind. And so what it started as just a kind of an experiment, and I got in all sorts of trouble for being my favorite term was writing a nefarious email that no one knew who it was from.
Oh, really?
Like,
Somewhat anonymous then in the beginning?
yeah, so the anonymity was entirely because I wanted people to focus on the message, not the messenger.
Mm-hmm.
uh, it quickly would be like, oh, well, this is this person's perspective, rather than, hey, what's this message, like what's that mean for me? And that was something which was actually quite effective. Although the other thing I loved was IT put a quote unquote kill order on the web address that it came from.
So you were sending it from a separate web address outside of your company then?
No, I had a friend in IT who generated a fake web address for me.
Okay, okay. Nefarious. Well, I'll tell you something. That's a great that story of like the starting of this Morning Cup is a great story. Now, can we share what company that was and what your background is, or do you prefer to keep that anonymous?
No, I worked at Lululemon for 8 years, so
Okay.
it was there. I don't think anyone's going to hunt me down for sharing
Sure.
that.
Well, and I think that's for listeners, that company, their success story. I'm sure you learned so much working for them. Just a great culture and a great company. So back to Morning Cup. So you started this while you were there, then.
Yeah, yeah. So I started there to, like I said, really generate conversations around like leadership and culture. I use culture loosely because I think it becomes a word that gets overused a bit and
Yeah, it
used,
can.
but that type of conversation, right? And as I started Dose, what I realized is the process of writing Morning Cup is one of the most fulfilling, gratifying, helpful development processes in my life. Like whether I write it weekly or sometimes I'll write a couple ahead of time if I have a lot of travel or something. But that process of sitting down and distilling my genius is so important. It's, if I believe in, distill your genius as a process and an idea, where am I doing that for myself? Because I certainly am not exempt. And every time I sit down to write it is just this wonderful reminder of, I have so much insight. I'm exposed to so much insight, and I have the opportunity and a platform to share that with people. And what I care about is people are living full, busy lives, and I don't need to write a 20-minute blog post for people to read.
Mm-hmm.
Rather, my commitment is it's a point of view or just something to get people's brains thinking. My intention is never for it to be preachy, like you need to do this, but it's more, here's a thought that someone can read in 3 minutes or less. And the reason I send it out Friday mornings is my experience, and it's been corroborated by many, many people, is Friday morning is the moment when we wake up, like, I need coffee and I just need something to spark my brain and get it going, because our cognitive capacity is a little bit lower and we're tired.
Mm-hmm.
The amount of times I've heard back from someone on a Friday morning of, this message was good, but it was more that I got this today at this time it just kickstarted my brain. Like, that's the greatest compliment I can get. I could care less if people agree or disagree. If it makes someone start thinking a little bit more, then Morning Cup has accomplished its purpose.
Well, yeah, and I've had a couple of doses of Morning Cup myself from your website, and they just kind of stimulating and kind of help you just see differently or get a different perspective. So how can people sign up for the Morning Cup? Does it go right into their email then?
Yeah. So if you go to my website, there's just a few tabs. It's like about neuroscience and leadership. And then the third tab over is Morning Cup. And right at the top of that, there's an email intake box. You throw your email in there and it will be sent directly to you.
Every Friday.
Hot and fresh, every Friday, 4 to 3 a.m. Pacific time.
Very nice. Very nice. Well, David, I have thoroughly enjoyed talking with you and listening, hearing about your coaching business. It's been very, very interesting chatting with you today. I appreciate that. Yeah.
Thanks for having me on. It's I wouldn't say I love coming and talking about myself, but I do. I love being able to be in this conversation because it's important. It's important that the business world is talking about this type of stuff as well as, P&Ls and bottom lines and all of that.
Yeah, I agree. It is important. That's one of the reasons, that I love doing these interviews. All right, well, we'll wrap it up. Again, thanks so much, David. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
You're welcome. Well, what'd you think? Did you come away with a renewed sense to start cultivating more of your childlike wonder? I know that I did. It's really so important, and I'm glad David brought this up and touched upon this, the importance of maintaining that beginner's mindset and that childlike wonder. Really, really important, because I think we do get so fixed in our adulting and what we think we know, which can also sometimes be very detrimental as we go out into the world and start taking action to produce the results that we want. It's really, really important to remind ourselves that childlike wonder is the key that's going to open up all the success that we want, right, in business or in life. So I want to thank David for bringing that up and hanging out with me on this episode of the podcast. Before we wrap it up, let me just remind you, if you got some value out of this episode, please share it with someone who you think might also like it. Also, feel free to comment when this episode goes up on YouTube. That's the best place to leave a comment, engage with other listeners. My YouTube channel is youtube.com/gmarkphillips. This episode will be up very shortly. And while you're there, be sure to subscribe to the channel and make a playlist and do all the things that YouTube is awesome for, so you can save this and refer back to it if you'd like to. And I want to thank you for listening. I really want to, extend my appreciation to you for hanging out with this on this episode of the podcast. I know there are so many podcasts to listen to out there, and the fact you're listening to this one really means a lot. I hope you got some value out of this episode. And at that point, we'll wrap it up. Until next time, I wish you all the best, health, wealth, and success. Bye-bye.